A door creaks in a frozen New England village. The year is 1692. This is the story you think you know, the Salem Witch Trials. But we are not here for the ghost story. We are here for the real mystery. By the end, you will understand the shocking blend of fear, fungus, and human conflict that doomed 20 innocent people. Was this panic caused by poisoned bread, or by the dark fears of a community tearing itself apart? How did the whispered accusations of children topple an entire system of justice? The truth is more unsettling than any legend. What does it take for an ordinary town to turn on itself? The frozen ground of Massachusetts was more than just dirt, it was a promise of hardship. To understand the panic, you must first step into the world of Salem Village. Picture a cluster of wooden houses clinging to the edge of a vast, dark forest, separated by miles of muddy, difficult roads from the relative bustle of Salem town. Life here was a daily siege against the elements, against hunger, and against a very tangible fear. Native American tribes resisting colonial expansion launched raids from those surrounding woods, making every trip to a distant field or a neighbor's home a potentially deadly journey. The isolation was profound, the winter darkness seemed to last forever, and survival was never guaranteed. This harsh physical reality was mirrored by an even stricter spiritual one. The Puritan settlers were not just religious, they lived inside a belief system that saw the world as a battlefield between God and Satan. The devil was not a metaphor, he was a cunning, active force constantly seeking to corrupt the faithful and destroy their holy experiment in the New World. Every misfortune, from a sick cow to a failed crop, could be interpreted as a sign of God's displeasure or the devil's direct interference. Their faith was one of intense scrutiny, both of oneself and of one's neighbors, for sin was a contagion that could doom the entire community. And within this tense, fearful atmosphere, a deep social fault line was cracking open. Just a few miles away, Salem town was a growing port, a place of merchants, sea captains, and new money. Its residents wore finer clothes, engaged in trade with the wider world, and represented a more modern, commercially minded way of life. Salem Village, in contrast, was populated largely by conservative farming families who saw this new prosperity as worldly, corrupt, and a threat to their traditional, pious way of life. They resented the town's influence and wealth, feeling politically and economically overshadowed. So when trouble began, it did not spark in a vacuum. It ignited in a tinderbox of geographical isolation, religious paranoia, and simmering class resentment. All it needed was a single, strange spark. The spark came from the most unexpected place, the quiet corner of a minister's house where young girls were meant to be learning their scripture. In the winter of 1692, Reverend Samuel Parris's 9-year-old daughter, Betty, and his 11-year-old niece, Abigail Williams, began to behave in ways that defied all explanation. They fell into violent fits, their bodies twisting into impossible contortions as they screamed in terror. They complained of feeling pinched and bitten by invisible hands. They hid under furniture. They muttered strange nonsense, and at times they seemed to be struck deaf and blind. The peaceful Parris household was transformed into a chamber of horrors, filled with the sounds of their distress. Soon, other girls in the village joined them, most notably 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr., and the circle of affliction widened. Reverend Parris, a man deeply invested in the spiritual purity of his community, was first bewildered, then terrified. He likely prayed for hours, searching his own soul and his theology for an answer. When prayers failed, he called upon the local physician, Dr. William Griggs. The doctor examined the girls, but their symptoms matched no physical illness he knew. In a diagnosis that would echo through history, he concluded the medical science of his time could not explain their torment. He declared the girls were under an evil hand. With those words, a medical mystery was officially transformed into a spiritual crisis. The genuine, palpable fear in that house was no longer just about sick children. It was a fear that the devil himself had laid a claim on Salem village, and he was starting with its most innocent souls. Pressure mounted on the afflicted girls to reveal who was tormenting them. In a community that believed the devil could not act without a human witch as his agent, the question was not if there was a witch but who. The girls, caught in a terrifying spotlight, were asked to name the specters they saw. Their first answers did not point to pillars of the community, but to three women already living on the social margins of Salem village. The first was Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Paris household who had been brought from Barbados. She was an outsider in every sense, with knowledge of folk traditions and stories that seemed strange and suspicious to her Puritan neighbors. The second was Sarah Good, a destitute woman who wandered from house to house begging, often muttering her displeasure when she was turned away empty-handed. The third was Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had scandalized the village by living with her indentured servant before marrying him, a move many saw as an attempt to cheat her own sons out of their inheritance. In the crowded, tense meeting house that served as a courtroom, the accusations became a terrifying public spectacle. When these three women were brought before the magistrates, the afflicted girls provided the evidence. If Sarah Good so much as clenched her hand, the girls would scream that they were being pinched. If Tituba shifted in her seat, they would fall to the floor, backs arched, crying out that she was tormenting them. Their performances were utterly convincing to an audience already primed to believe in spectral attack. The magistrates, men like John Hathorne, leaned forward and demanded the accused women confess. Sarah Good defiantly proclaimed her innocence, blaming Sarah Osborne instead. Sarah Osborne, frail and ill, pleaded that she was more likely to be bewitched than to be a witch herself. Then came Tituba's turn, under intense questioning and likely facing the threat of brutal punishment or even death. The enslaved woman made a decision that would change everything. She confessed, but this was no simple admission. She gave the magistrates and the horrified townspeople exactly what they secretly feared most. She spoke of a tall man from Boston who had appeared to her, a figure in black who demanded she sign his book and serve him. She described signing with her own blood. She said this man, this devil, had commanded her to hurt the children. And then, most damningly, she claimed she had seen other names in that book, the names of Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. But she did not stop there. She hinted that there were more witches, many more, that she had seen other marks she could not read. With her detailed, vivid testimony, Tituba transformed the panic from a local tragedy into a vast conspiracy. She confirmed the community's deepest fear that the devil was not working through one or two outcasts but had infiltrated Salem itself. Her confession made the invisible threat terrifyingly real, and it gave the hunt for witches a deadly new momentum. The hunt, it seemed, had only just begun. With Tituba's confession, the hunt had a terrifying new shape, but it lacked an official mechanism for punishment. That changed in the spring of 1692. As accusations multiplied, overwhelming the local magistrates, the colonial governor, Sir William Phips, took action upon his return from a military campaign. In late May, he created a special court to deal solely with the witchcraft crisis, the Court of Oyer and Terminer. Its name, from Old French legal terms, literally meant to hear and to determine. Its chief justice was Lieutenant Governor William Stoughton, a man of unwavering conviction and deep Puritan piety, who believed he was engaged in a holy war against Satan's agents. This court was not designed for careful deliberation. It was engineered for swift judgment. Its procedures stripped away the few protections an accused person might have expected. Defendants had no legal counsel. They could not call witnesses to challenge the spectral claims against them, and the judges themselves acted as both prosecutors and jury, actively questioning the accused with clear bias. The most dangerous tool in the court's arsenal was the doctrine of spectral evidence. This was the belief that the devil could not assume the shape of an innocent person. Therefore, if an afflicted girl screamed that she saw the ghostly shape of Goody Proctor pinching her, that spectral vision was accepted as ironclad proof that the real, living Goody Proctor had made a pact with the devil and was actively tormenting her. It was a perfect, inescapable circle of logic for the accusers and an impossible defense for the accused. How do you prove you are not somewhere in spirit form? Among the judges sat Samuel Sewall, a wealthy merchant and devout man who kept a famous diary. He, like his colleagues, entered the proceedings with a sincere desire to cleanse the colony of evil. The atmosphere in the courtroom was one of collective panic masquerading as solemn duty. The afflicted girls, now local celebrities of a macabre sort, would perform their fits on cue, their screams and contortions serving as the primary evidence. If an accused person remained calm, it was seen as the devil's cold influence. If they showed emotion or anger, it was proof of their malevolent nature. The court became a deadly conveyor belt, transforming whispered gossip and spectral visions into legally sanctioned death sentences. Under Staunton's stern guidance, the machinery of condemnation began to turn with grim efficiency, and the first convictions were only weeks away. The accusations became a wildfire, and the wind that spread it was fear. What began in the confined, suspicious world of Salem Village soon leaped its boundaries, racing down the roads to neighboring towns like Andover and Topsfield. The initial targets had been easy to suspect: the impoverished, the strange, the outsiders. But the logic of spectral evidence knew no such limits. If the devil could recruit the lowly, why not the powerful? Why not the pillars of the community itself? The afflicted girls, now empowered by the authority of the court, began to name names that sent a new, deeper chill through the colony. They pointed at men and women of impeccable reputation, pious church members, and even former leaders. This was the moment the panic truly metastasized, transforming from a purge of the marginal into a purge of the heart. One of the most shocking accusations was leveled against Rebecca Nurse. At 71 years old, she was a grandmother many times over, known for her gentle piety and devotion. Her family was well respected, and she was a full member of the church, a rare honor that signified a life of proven virtue. When she was accused, many in the community were stunned. Her initial trial seemed to reflect this doubt. The jury, after deliberation, returned a verdict of not guilty. A murmur of relief and agreement swept the courtroom. But then the afflicted girls erupted in fresh, dramatic fits, screaming that the specter of Rebecca Nurse was attacking them for the verdict. The judges intervened, asking the jury to reconsider one piece of testimony. Under this pressure, the jury changed its mind. Rebecca Nurse was convicted. A public outcry from her supporters prompted the governor to grant a reprieve, but another furious wave of protest from the accusers and their allies forced him to withdraw it. This pious grandmother, hearing impaired and frail, was hanged on July 19, 1692. Her execution was a turning point, a clear signal that no one, not even the most saintly, was safe. Then came the accusations that challenged the very foundation of spiritual authority. The girls named George Burroughs, a former minister of Salem Village who had left years earlier under a cloud of debt and disputes. They claimed he was the black man Tituba had described, the leader of the witches' coven. They testified that this ordained minister could perform superhuman feats of strength and had presided over satanic baptisms in a forest clearing. His arrest was a profound scandal. Here was a man who had once stood in the pulpit and delivered sermons, now accused of being the devil's chief lieutenant in New England. His trial focused heavily on these sensational stories, and despite his powerful defense and recitation of the Lord's Prayer from the gallows, a feat believed impossible for a witch, he was hanged. The accusation of a minister laid bare a terrifying truth for the Puritans. If Satan could corrupt their own shepherds, then the entire flock was in unimaginable peril. Fear had become the most potent currency in the colony, and it was now being spent to settle old accounts. The trials were no longer just about witchcraft, they were about land, inheritance, and long-standing grudges. Accusers sometimes found themselves inheriting the property of the condemned. Families who had argued over boundaries for decades saw a chance to remove a troublesome neighbor with a single, whispered allegation. The mechanism was horrifyingly simple: voice a suspicion to one of the afflicted girls and let the unstoppable machine of the court do the rest. This was not mere superstition, it was power, raw and unchecked, using the language of demons to achieve very human goals. The community was not just hunting witches, it was consuming itself, neighbor turning on neighbor in a desperate, deadly scramble for security and advantage. And as the gallows claimed more lives, a few brave voices began to speak against the storm, risking everything to question the very foundations of the nightmare. Behind the public spectacle of the trials lay a hidden world of suffering. For the accused, the ordeal began long before they ever stood before the judges. It started in the dark, airless cells of overcrowded jails. The main prisons in Salem and Boston were not designed for long-term confinement. They were holding pens of stone and timber, bitterly cold in winter, sweltering and foul in summer. Dozens of people, men and women, were crammed into single rooms, their ankles shackled with heavy iron chains. The stench was overwhelming, a mix of unwashed bodies, human waste and despair. Disease spread quickly in these conditions, and for the elderly or infirm, imprisonment itself could be a death sentence. Among the most heartbreaking details were the children. Infants were not spared. They were taken to jail with their accused mothers because there was no one else to care for them. Several, including the baby of Sarah Good, perished in that grim darkness, their short lives ended by the cruelty of a system that saw them as collateral damage in a holy war. Before even reaching the courtroom, the accused faced relentless interrogations. The goal was not to discover the truth, but to secure a confession, the only thing that could potentially save their lives, though it would brand them forever. Magistrates and ministers would circle a terrified prisoner for hours, badgering them with leading questions, quoting scripture, and describing the torments of hell that awaited the unrepentant. They played on every fear, offering mercy in exchange for admitting a pact with the devil and, crucially, for naming other witches. This psychological pressure was immense, a torturous marathon designed to break the spirit. Some, like Tituba, confessed to end the torment. Others, determined to protect their souls and their neighbors, held fast to the truth, even as they knew it might send them to the gallows. The court also employed bizarre physical tests that twisted simple human contact into proof of guilt. One of the most perverse was the touch test. An afflicted person in the throes of a fit would be brought to the accused. If the accused touched them and the fit suddenly stopped, it was proclaimed as definitive evidence that the witch had been the source of the torment all along. Of course, the calming effect was often a rehearsed performance by the accuser, a scripted end to the drama once the designated villain had been physically identified. This pseudo-scientific ritual gave a veneer of legitimacy to the proceedings, making the supernatural seem tangible and controllable, at least for the terrified onlookers. Then there was the case of Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer whose defiance became legendary. When he was arrested and brought to trial, he understood the grim arithmetic of the court. If he pleaded guilty or not guilty, his property would be forfeit to the state, leaving his family destitute. If he refused to enter a plea at all, the court could not try him. Knowing this, Corey chose a third, horrifying path. He stood mute before the judges, uttering only 2 repeated words when ordered to plead more weight. The court invoked an ancient English punishment called peine forte et dure, pressing to death. Giles Corey was stripped naked, a board placed upon his chest, and over 2 days, sheriff's deputies slowly loaded it with massive stones. The old man's ribs cracked, his breath grew shallow, but he never gave them the plea they demanded. His final words, shouted with his last gasps, were a curse upon the sheriff and the town of Salem. He died to protect his land for his heirs, the only victim in American history to be executed in this medieval manner. His terrible death was not an act of madness, but a calculated, brutal protest against a legal system that had abandoned all justice. It was a silence that echoed louder than any scream in the courtroom, a final, unanswered question about how far this community would go. And as the body count rose, that question began to haunt not just the victims, but the men who had set the wheels in motion. The first to die was Bridget Bishop. She was a woman who stood out in a community that valued conformity, the owner of a tavern where people played forbidden games like shuffleboard, and known for wearing a bright red bodice, a color Puritans associated with vanity and sin. Her independent life had long made her a target for gossip, and now it made her the first victim of the gallows. On June 10, 1692, a somber procession wound its way up the rocky slope known as Gallows Hill. Authorities led Bridget, bound and guarded, past a crowd of her neighbors, many of whom had come to witness the terrible spectacle of divine justice. Public executions were meant to be moral lessons, a final chance for the condemned to confess and save their soul, and a stark warning to the community. From the scaffold, ministers would exhort the crowd to heed the fate of sinners. Bridget Bishop maintained her innocence to the end. With a hood placed over her head and a noose around her neck, she was pushed from a ladder, her death a brutal punctuation mark to the court's first sentence. The body was likely buried in a shallow grave near the gallows, denied a proper Christian burial in consecrated ground. Her execution made the terror utterly real. The court had tasted blood, and it was not enough. 5 weeks later, on July 19th, the gallows claimed 5 more lives. This was the group that included the pious Rebecca Nurse. The scene repeated, but the atmosphere was different. Rebecca, nearly deaf and faint from months in jail, required support to climb the hill. Her dignity in the face of such injustice was profound. Also hanged that day was Sarah Good, the beggar who had been among the first accused. As she stood on the ladder, the minister urged her to confess. She turned her fury on him, declaring, "I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." Her curse would later be remembered with a shudder when that minister died decades later, choking on his own blood from an internal hemorrhage. The 5 bodies swinging in the summer air sent a clear message: neither piety nor poverty offered protection. The third execution date, August 19th, brought another 5 to Gallows Hill. This group included the former minister, George Burroughs. His execution was a pivotal moment. Standing on the ladder before the vast crowd, he faced them with the authority of his former office. In a clear, strong voice, he recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly from beginning to end. This was believed to be an impossible feat for a witch, as folklore held the devil would not allow his servants to utter such holy words. A murmur of doubt and pity rippled through the spectators. For a moment, it seemed the spell of fear might break, but then one of the leading witch hunters, Cotton Mather, who was present on horseback, addressed the uneasy crowd. He reminded them that the devil was a deceiver and that even a wizard could be granted the appearance of piety to lead them astray. The moment of potential mercy passed. The ladder was kicked away and George Burroughs joined the others in death. His perfect prayer, however, lingered in the minds of many, a seed of doubt that would later grow. The final mass execution occurred on September 22nd, when 8 people were hanged. They were a mix of men and women, including Martha Corey, the wife of the pressed Giles Corey, and Mary Easty, the sister of the already executed Rebecca Nurse. In a final, heartbreaking plea written days before, Mary Easty had petitioned the court not for her own life, but for a change in procedure so that no more innocent blood would be shed. Her request was ignored. These 8 deaths brought the total executed by hanging to 19. With Giles Corey pressed to death 3 days earlier, the final toll stood at 20 lives extinguished. The human cost was not just a number, it was a community that had lost mothers, fathers, farmers, and a grandmother known for her kindness. It was children orphaned and families shattered, their names forever stained. The bodies on Gallows Hill were a testament to a justice system consumed by its own certainty, a certainty that was finally, and far too late, beginning to crack under its own weight. But even as the gallows claimed its final victims, a profound unease was spreading through the colony like a slow thaw. The relentless accusations had created a monster that no longer distinguished between the outcast and the elite, and that was a problem for the men in power. The first public cracks in the court's authority came from a most unexpected quarter, not from the clergy or the judges, but from a merchant, Thomas Brattle, a wealthy and well-educated Bostonian with a keen interest in science and mathematics, watched the proceedings with growing horror and intellectual disgust. In a private letter that was widely circulated among the colony's leaders in October of 1692, he launched a meticulously reasoned attack on the entire process. He dismantled the court's reliance on spectral evidence, calling it the devil's own testimony. He pointed out the absurdity of the touch test and the hypocrisy of accepting the wild, contradictory claims of the afflicted girls as gospel truth. His letter was not an emotional plea, it was a legal and logical indictment, arguing that the court had abandoned all principles of English common law in its rush to convict. It gave voice to the silent doubts of many who were afraid to speak, providing them with the intellectual ammunition to question the nightmare. At the same time, from within the ranks of the suffering, came a plea of such raw moral clarity that it could not be ignored. This was the petition of Mary Easty, the sister of Rebecca Nurse, written just days before her own execution. She did not beg for her life. Instead, she addressed the court with heartbreaking dignity, asking them to consider that if her own innocent blood was to be shed, they must change their methods to prevent further tragedy. She wrote, "I petition to your honors not for my own life, for I know I must die, but that no more innocent blood be shed." Her words were a selfless act of conscience that stood in stark contrast to the court's self-righteous fury, a mother's final attempt to protect other families from the grief consuming her own. The final, decisive shock to the system came when the accusing finger pointed directly at the pinnacle of colonial society. The afflicted girls, perhaps emboldened by their unchecked power, began to name the wives of the most prominent men in Massachusetts. Most stunningly, they accused Lady Mary Phipps, the wife of Governor Sir William Phipps himself. Other accusations landed on the spouses of wealthy merchants and leading ministers. This was a fatal miscalculation. The wealthy and connected had tolerated the trials as long as they were cleansing the village of its poor and troublesome elements. But when the spectral threat arrived in their own parlors and bedchambers, the entire enterprise suddenly looked different, less like a holy crusade and more like a dangerous social contagion that respected no rank. The elite's self-preservation instincts kicked in powerfully. They could now see the monster they had created, and it was at their door. Governor Phipps, facing a rebellion from his own class and a colony descending into utter chaos, finally intervened. In late October, he ordered that spectral evidence could no longer be admitted as proof in the trials. Without that foundation, the entire case against every accused person collapsed like a house of cards. The court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved. The witch panic, which had burned so fiercely for 9 months, was officially over, extinguished not by a wave of mercy, but by cold political necessity and the fear of the powerful. The storm had passed, but the devastation it left behind was total, and the long, painful reckoning was just beginning. Yet even as the governor acted, the moral and intellectual foundation for ending the trials was being laid by one of the colony's most revered figures. Increase Mather was not a fringe critic. He was the president of Harvard College and perhaps the most influential minister in all of New England. His voice carried immense weight in matters of both faith and governance. In the early months of the crisis, Mather, like most of the Puritan leadership, had been cautiously supportive of the court's efforts. He shared the belief that Satan was a real and present threat and that witches must be rooted out. He even oversaw the publication of a book by his son, Cotton Mather, which detailed some of the early afflictions, lending a scholarly endorsement to the proceedings. But as the summer of 1692 wore on and the accusations grew more outlandish, Mather's deep learning and theological rigor began to clash with the court's methods. He grew deeply troubled by the reliance on spectral evidence. How could a vision, a phantom seen only by the afflicted, be the sole basis for taking a human life? His concern was not just legal, it was profoundly spiritual. If the devil could indeed assume the shape of an innocent person, as some scripture suggested, then the entire premise of the court was fatally flawed. They were not hunting witches, they were potentially executing the blameless on the testimony of the father of lies himself. This was a catastrophic risk to the soul of the community. Mather convened a council of 14 fellow ministers in Boston. After intense debate, they drafted a crucial document that would become known as Cases of Conscience Concerning Evil Spirits. Published in October of 1692, just as the governor was moving to halt the trials, this treatise was a bombshell. In clear, forceful prose, Mather dismantled the legal basis of the witch hunt. He argued that spectral evidence was unreliable and diabolical in origin, but his most powerful and enduring statement was a principle of justice that echoed through the ages. He wrote, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned." This was a revolutionary idea in a culture obsessed with purging sin at any cost. Mather was prioritizing mercy and the protection of the innocent over the ruthless pursuit of the guilty. He was arguing that a society's righteousness was measured not by how many demons it caught, but by how scrupulously it guarded justice. His words provided the governor and the doubting elite with the moral cover they needed to act. They could now oppose the trials not as defenders of witches, but as defenders of a higher, more prudent biblical law. Increase Mather did not stop the panic with a shout, but with a meticulously reasoned sermon, turning the very theology that had fueled the fear into the key that finally unlocked the prison doors. Governor William Phips returned from a military campaign to a colony on the brink of civil collapse. The roads were thick with rumor, the jails were overflowing with the accused, and the once orderly Puritan society was tearing itself apart from the inside. The pressure on him was immense and came from all sides. The anguished petitions from families like the nurses and the Coreys painted a picture of profound injustice. The circulated letter from Thomas Brattle laid out a devastating legal critique, and perhaps most influentially, the powerful treatise from Increase Mather and the Ministers' Council gave him the theological justification he needed to act without appearing soft on the devil. Phips, a man of action more than deep theology, faced a simple, brutal calculation: allow the trials to continue and watch the colony's leading families turn against him, or intervene and try to salvage what remained of Massachusetts Bay's stability. In late October of 1692, he issued the order that broke the panic's back. He commanded that spectral evidence was no longer to be considered sufficient proof for a conviction. With that single decree, the entire legal engine of the witch hunt ground to a halt. The testimony of the afflicted girls, which had been the very heart of every case, was suddenly rendered legally meaningless. Without their visions and fits as evidence, there was no case against anyone. Almost immediately, the frantic pace of accusations and trials stopped. Then Phips went further. He formally dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer, the very institution he had created just 5 months earlier to solve the crisis. The special court was no more. Its Chief Justice, William Stoughton, was furious, reportedly storming off the bench in a rage, convinced the governor was surrendering to the forces of darkness. But the governor's duty was to the colony's survival, not to one man's unbending certainty. The official witch hunt was over, yet a practical problem remained. Dozens of people still languished in prison, and a handful of cases were technically unresolved. To address this, Phips authorized a new Superior Court of Judicature to handle the remaining witchcraft cases in the new year. This court operated under the governor's strict new rules. Spectral evidence was banned. The result was a dramatic reversal. When this new court convened in January of 1693, it heard over 50 cases. Without the spectral testimony, only 3 people were convicted, and Governor Phipps swiftly pardoned them. By May, he issued a general pardon, releasing all remaining prisoners. The legal nightmare had finally, officially ended, but the shadow it cast was long and dark, and the community now had to face the chilling reality of what it had done. The legal machinery had stopped, but the human wreckage remained. In the grim jails of Salem and Boston, over 150 people still waited in chains, their lives suspended in a nightmare that the outside world now declared over. The new Superior Court of Judicature, bound by the governor's ban on spectral evidence, began its work in early 1693. The change was immediate and stark. Without the testimony of the afflicted girls, case after case collapsed. Of the more than 50 individuals brought before this new court, only 3 were convicted, and Governor Phipps quickly issued pardons for them. By May, he signed a general pardon, an official act of mercy that unlocked every prison door. The release was not a joyous parade, but a somber exodus of the broken. Men and women, some who had been confined for nearly a year, stumbled back into the sunlight, blinking and frail. They returned to find their farms neglected, their livestock dead or stolen, and their reputations in tatters. Many were financially ruined, having been forced to pay for their own imprisonment, a cruel fee for the privilege of surviving their wrongful arrest. Families reunited, but the trauma was a ghost that moved in with them. The community now faced the awkward, painful reality of living alongside those they had condemned. Meanwhile, a strange and unsettling truth persisted. The fear did not simply switch off. Some of the afflicted accusers, like Ann Putnam Jr., continued to suffer fits and claim they were tormented by specters, even after the court had dismissed their visions as legally worthless. This suggested that whatever had sparked the original physical symptoms, whether mass hysteria, illness, or something else, had not been cured by a governor's decree. The psychological and social scars were deep, a constant, silent tension woven into the fabric of daily life. Neighbors who had testified against each other now had to share the same meeting house on Sunday. Families who had lost loved ones to the gallows had to walk past the empty homes of those who had accused them. Salem was a community sentenced to live with what it had done, a permanent, haunting reminder of its own capacity for cruelty. The work of rebuilding would require more than just opening jail cells. It would demand a reckoning with conscience, and that process would take decades. A courtroom could deliver a pardon, but only conscience could deliver true justice. For the people of Massachusetts, the years after the trials were a long, slow walk out of the shadows, a painful journey toward accountability. The legal system had moved on, but the moral ledger remained painfully unbalanced. How does a community begin to repair a wound it inflicted upon itself? The answer came not in a single act, but in a series of halting, public gestures of remorse that were as unprecedented as the tragedy itself. The most profound of these occurred on a quiet Sabbath day in early 1697, inside Boston's Old South Meeting House. Judge Samuel Sewall, one of the 9 magistrates of the Court of Oyer and Terminer, rose from his pew. He was a wealthy merchant, a Harvard graduate, and a pillar of the community. As the congregation watched in solemn silence, the minister read aloud a statement Sewall had prepared. In it, the judge took full responsibility, accepting what he called the blame and shame for his role in the proceedings. He asked for the forgiveness of God and his fellow man, and he prayed that the terrible tragedy would not be held against New England or the Reformed churches of the world. This was no vague expression of regret. It was a targeted, personal, and humiliating act of public penance. While other judges, like the unrepentant William Stoughton, remained defiantly silent, Sewall chose to stand alone, literally and morally, bearing the weight of the colony's guilt. He would later dedicate a day each year to fasting and prayer for his sins. and his famous diary shows a man forever haunted by his participation, a living testament to the cost of a troubled conscience. His solitary act created a template for repentance. Following this lead, the colonial government took an extraordinary step. They proclaimed an official day of fasting and humiliation across Massachusetts. This was not a holiday, it was a somber collective ritual of atonement. On that day, families were to abstain from food, businesses were to close, and entire communities were to gather in their meeting houses. Ministers delivered sermons reflecting on the errors of the witch trials, urging their congregations to search their own hearts for the seeds of malice, credulity, and haste that had allowed the tragedy to unfold. It was an admission from the highest authority that the entire social and spiritual body had been sick, and that healing required a unified, deliberate act of contrition. Words and prayers, however, could not restore stolen lives or rebuild ruined farms. The final, most tangible step in the reckoning was the agonizingly slow process of restitution. For years, the families of the victims petitioned the government for compensation, detailing their financial losses from jail fees, confiscated property, and the death of breadwinners. The colonial legislature, in fits and starts, began to approve monetary payments. In 1711, a more comprehensive act was passed, reversing the attainders or legal condemnations of many of those executed, effectively restoring their names and allowing their heirs to inherit property. Monetary sums were authorized for the families of the victims, yet this justice was incomplete and painfully delayed, arriving nearly 2 decades after the hangings. For many, like the descendants of Giles Corey, the money was a cold comfort that could never fill the void left by a father pressed to death for his principles. The restitution was an official acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a material apology, but it could never truly balance the scales. The community had taken a necessary, difficult path from denial to confession, and from confession toward a fragile reconciliation. But even as the living sought to make amends, the search for a simpler, more scientific explanation for the horror was just beginning, an attempt to understand what invisible force had first seized the minds of those young girls in the minister's parlor. The search for a single, tangible cause for the girls' afflictions led scientists to a tiny, purple-black fungus. In the 1970s, a researcher named Linda Caporal published a startling theory, proposing the Salem Witch Trials began not with the devil but with poisoned bread. Her suspect was a parasitic fungus called Claviceps purpurea, more commonly known as ergot. This fungus infects rye and other cereal grains, transforming healthy kernels into dark, hardened structures called sclerotia. These sinister little lumps are chemical factories producing a cocktail of powerful alkaloids, compounds closely related to lysergic acid, the foundational ingredient of the hallucinogen LSD. If these contaminated sclerotia were harvested along with the grain, ground into flour and baked into bread, the poison would enter the food supply. Consuming ergot-contaminated food over time leads to a condition called ergotism, with 2 recognized forms. One causes gangrene and a painful burning sensation known historically as St. Anthony's fire. The other, the convulsive form, produces a suite of symptoms that read like a checklist from Salem. Victims suffer from violent muscle spasms and contortions, a feeling of insects crawling under the skin, vertigo, headaches, vomiting, and vivid hallucinations. The afflicted girls described being pinched and bitten by invisible beings. They writhed in pain, their bodies twisted into strange postures, and they reported seeing specters and visions. To a Puritan community with no knowledge of neurotoxins, what else could such torment be but witchcraft? The theory gained further traction from the weather. The year before the outbreak, 1691, was notably wet and warm following a harsh winter, the precise conditions that favor the growth and proliferation of the ergot fungus in damp, low-lying fields. If the villagers' rye crop was contaminated, the entire community could have been exposed to low levels of the toxin, with the children, who ate less but had smaller body masses, potentially suffering the most acute and dramatic effects. This biological explanation provides a compelling, physical trigger for the terror. It suggests the girls were not lying or acting, but were genuinely experiencing terrifying physiological and neurological symptoms they could not possibly understand. Their authentic suffering gave the subsequent accusations an undeniable power, a kernel of truth around which the pearl of mass hysteria could form. The ergot theory elegantly bridges the gap between the supernatural and the scientific, offering a plausible reason why upstanding families would believe their daughters were under an evil hand. Yet the ergot theory, for all its scientific intrigue, begins to fray under closer historical scrutiny. Consider the pattern of the afflictions. True ergotism is a brutal, democratic poison. It does not discriminate. If a community's bread supply was contaminated, we would expect to see widespread illness, not isolated outbreaks in a handful of teenage girls. Men, women, and other children eating from the same harvest should have fallen violently ill, yet no such epidemic was recorded. The symptoms themselves pose another problem. Ergot poisoning typically causes prolonged, debilitating physical agony, muscle contractions so severe they can fracture bones, along with gangrene, vomiting, and a generalized state of sickness. The afflicted girls, however, displayed a startling control over their torments. Their fits were episodic and performative, flaring up dramatically in court when an accused person looked at them, then subsiding just as quickly. They were not bedridden invalids, they were active participants in a terrifying social drama, able to name their tormentors and pinpoint the moment a spectral attack began. This suggests a psychological or social trigger, not a relentless neurological toxin coursing through their veins. Most damningly, the map of accusations defies a biological explanation. The accusations did not spread randomly like a disease. They followed the precise, jagged lines of long-standing village feuds, property disputes, and social resentments. If ergot was the sole cause, why did the girls consistently target the neighbors their families had argued with for years, and never the wealthy merchants of Salem town who would have purchased grain from the same region? The poison, it seems, was in the human heart long before it could ever have been in the rye. While the fungus provides a compelling potential spark for the initial physical sensations, it cannot account for the deliberate direction of the flame or the explosive social tinder it found waiting. The real horror of Salem was not a mystery of biology, but a tragedy of human psychology, one where fear became a weapon and belief turned into a contagion far more potent than any grain mold. Perhaps the most powerful explanation lies not in the grain fields, but in the human mind itself. Modern psychology offers a framework for understanding the girls' afflictions, a phenomenon known as mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called conversion disorder. This occurs when extreme psychological stress, often within a tightly knit group, manifests as physical symptoms with no underlying medical cause. The symptoms are absolutely real to the person experiencing them. They are not faking. For the young women of Salem Village, the pressures were immense and inescapable. They lived in a culture of profound emotional repression. Puritan doctrine demanded strict self-control, particularly for girls, who were expected to be silent, obedient, and devoid of personal expression. Joy was suspect, anger was sinful, and curiosity was dangerous. Every natural impulse of adolescence was bottled up under immense spiritual pressure. The fits provided a terrifying but effective release valve. Suddenly, these girls could scream, thrash, and command the attention of every adult in the room, from their parents to the most powerful magistrates. They could speak of forbidden things like specters and dark books without being held responsible for the words, as it was the affliction speaking through them. What began as a genuine, shared stress response may have quickly learned its own power, reinforced by the intense focus and belief of the entire community. Their involuntary twitches could have become conscious performances, a desperate and unconscious bid for agency in a world that gave them none. This psychological lens turns the girls from malicious conspirators into tragic figures, victims of a culture whose very rigidity created the symptoms it then punished so brutally. But psychology alone cannot explain why the community so eagerly believed them. For that, we must look at the sociology of fear. Salem was a community under siege, not just by spectral forces, but by very real, tangible threats. The frontier wars with Native American tribes were a constant source of terror and loss, with raids destroying homes and families. Smallpox outbreaks swept through periodically, a silent, invisible killer that no prayer could reliably stop. Politically, the colony's charter had been revoked, creating uncertainty about their legal rights and their very future. Their Puritan way of life felt besieged by a changing world. In such a state of chronic collective anxiety, humans have a profound need to make the threat concrete, to give it a name and a face they can fight. When misfortune has no clear cause, we invent one. The marginalized members of the community, the Sarah Goods and the Tutubas, became perfect vessels for this projected fear. They were the other, already living on the edges, already viewed with suspicion. By accusing them of witchcraft, the community could transform its diffuse, uncontrollable dread into a specific, solvable problem. We are not afraid of famine, disease, and war. They could tell themselves, we are afraid of this witch, and a witch can be identified, tried, and eliminated. This process, called scapegoating, is an ancient and tragic human impulse. It creates a fragile sense of order and control by unifying the group against a common enemy. The ritual of the trials, the public accusations, the dramatic confessions, and even the executions on Gallows Hill became a brutal kind of community therapy, a way to purge the perceived poison from their midst. It was a catastrophic failure of empathy, where the very real suffering of a few became the excuse to inflict far greater suffering on others. So we are left with a layered truth, a perfect storm where potential biological triggers met profound psychological repression, all within a social pressure cooker ready to explode. The tragedy of Salem was not that people believed in witches, but that in their desperate search for certainty, they forgot how to see their neighbors as human. While fear and psychology set the stage, the accusations themselves followed a precise, human map of old grudges and simmering rivalries. To understand who was named and why, we must look at the deep fissures that already split Salem Village, particularly the bitter feud between two powerful families, the Putnams and the Porters. This conflict was the engine that directed the terror, transforming spectral visions into targeted attacks. The Putnam family, led by Thomas Putnam Sr. and his brother Lieutenant Nathaniel, were large landowners who represented the old guard. They were conservative farmers, deeply committed to the traditional, isolated agrarian life of the village. They resented the growing influence and wealth of Salem town, seeing its merchants as worldly and corrupt. In contrast, the Porter family were rising capitalists. They owned mills, engaged in coastal trade, and had strong connections to the commercial hub of Salem town. They represented progress, connection, and a new economic order that threatened the Putnams' way of life. The two families were locked in a struggle over the very soul of the community, a battle fought in meetinghouse votes, land disputes, and church politics. When the witch panic began, the Putnam family became its most vocal and prolific accusers. Thomas Putnam's wife, Ann Putnam Sr., and their 12-year-old daughter, Ann Putnam Jr., were at the very heart of the afflicted circle. The family would eventually be involved in over half of all the legal complaints. Their accusations did not spray out randomly. They consistently targeted their rivals, their enemies, and those allied with the Porter faction. The Porter family, meanwhile, found themselves squarely in the crosshairs. Many Porters, their in-laws, and their allies were accused or boldly stepped forward to defend the accused, putting themselves at great risk. This was not a coincidence, it was a purge, A witchcraft allegation became the ultimate social weapon, a way to remove a troublesome neighbor, seize contested land, or silence a political opponent under the unimpeachable guise of fighting the devil. The tragic case of Rebecca Nurse is the clearest example of a personal grievance dressed in spectral clothing. Rebecca and her husband, Francis, were pious, respected farmers, but they were also allies of the Porter family. More concretely, the Nurse family had been engaged in a bitter, years-long boundary dispute with the Putnam family over woodland. This was not a minor squabble. Land was life, it was wealth, it was legacy. The Putnams believed the Nurses had encroached on their property, so when the accusations began to fly, who did Anne Putnam Sr. and her daughter first name as tormenting them? The specter of Rebecca Nurse. At her trial, the testimony against her was notably vague on supernatural details but heavy with hints of past animosity. Other accusers, neighbors of the Putnams, also came forward. Their spectral visions conveniently served to eliminate a family that had been a thorn in the Putnam's side for a generation. Even Rebecca's own sisters, Mary Easty and Sarah Cloyce, were soon accused and condemned, effectively wiping out an entire family line that had opposed the Putnam interests. The pattern repeats across the roster of the condemned. George Burroughs, the former minister, had left Salem Village after clashing with the Putnam faction over his salary and his handling of church discipline. John Proctor was a wealthy farmer and tavern keeper who had vocal disdain for the witch trials and was connected to the Porter commercial network. His wife, Elizabeth, was accused, and when he defended her too fiercely, he was immediately named as well. Martha Corey, another pious church member, had expressed skepticism about the girl's claims, challenging the Putnam-led narrative. Giles Corey, as we know, had a history of lawsuits and contentious dealings with his neighbors. In each case, the accusation served a double purpose. It removed a specific person who was a social, economic, or political obstacle, while also reinforcing the power of the accusers. The trials became a deadly tool for settling scores, allowing old resentments to be acted out with the full, terrifying authority of the church and the state. The invisible world of spirits became a theater where very visible, very human conflicts reached their final, tragic conclusion. Her confession was a masterclass in survival, a desperate act that changed everything. To understand Tituba, we must first look past the simple label of slave. Her origins are shrouded, but historians suggest she was likely an Arawak Indian from South America or an Afro-Caribbean woman from Barbados, brought into the Paris household with a worldview utterly alien to the Puritans. She was not a blank slate. She carried within her a rich tapestry of folk beliefs, healing practices, and stories of spirits that interacted with the living world. When she found herself at the center of the storm, accused by the very children she helped care for, she faced an impossible choice. The magistrates demanded a confession, and the alternative was almost certainly a brutal death. So Tituba did not just confess, she performed. She gave them a story so detailed, so vivid, and so perfectly tailored to their deepest fears that it temporarily saved her life. She spoke of signing the devil's book with her blood, of a tall man from Boston in black who commanded her, but she also wove in elements that may have sprung from her own cultural memory, strange and colorful details that would have sounded exotic and terrifying to New England ears. She described a red cat, a yellow bird, and other familiars, creatures that served as intermediaries between a witch and the supernatural. In Caribbean and West African spiritual traditions, animals often played such roles as guides or messengers, but to the Puritans, they could only be demons in disguise. Her testimony was a dangerous cultural collision. She was likely trying to appease her interrogators by giving them what they wanted, using the narrative tools she had. She may have even believed that by confessing and naming others, she was participating in a kind of ritual cleansing that would end the crisis. Instead, she handed the terrified community a complete blueprint for their nightmare. By confirming that the devil was real, that he had a book with names, and that he was actively recruiting in their midst, she made the invisible conspiracy feel terrifyingly tangible. Her strategic survival tactic became the spark that ignited the inferno because she was the only one who gave the panic a coherent, believable story. The tall man from Boston, the spectral animals, the blood pact, these were not just admissions, they were world-building for a collective delusion. In trying to save herself, Tituba, the ultimate outsider, accidentally authored the script that would condemn her neighbors. The legal shadow of Salem stretched far beyond the rocky soil of Gallows Hill. In the quiet courtrooms of a new nation, the tragedy became a hard-won lesson etched into the very foundation of American law. The most immediate and obvious legacy was the permanent discrediting of spectral evidence. That dangerous legal fiction, which had turned nightmares into death sentences, was so thoroughly repudiated that it never again held sway in an American courtroom. The principle established by Increase Mather that it is better for 10 guilty to go free than for 1 innocent to be condemned evolved into a bedrock legal standard, the presumption of innocence. This idea that the state must prove its case with solid, tangible evidence and that the accused bears no burden to prove they did not commit a crime became central to the American justice system. It is the reason you hear the phrase innocent until proven guilty. Furthermore, the right to legal counsel denied to every defendant in Salem was later enshrined as a fundamental protection. The image of a lone, terrified farmer standing before a panel of hostile judges with no one to speak in his defense became a powerful argument for ensuring everyone has a lawyer. Salem taught a brutal lesson about the speed at which fear can corrupt justice, and the framers of the American legal system built safeguards against that very contagion. But the legacy is not just found in law books, it lives in our cultural memory as a warning symbol. Centuries later, during the McCarthy era of the 1950s, the term witch hunt was revived with chilling precision. Senator Joseph McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee did not speak of specters, but of communist infiltrators, an invisible, subversive threat within. The accusations were often based on rumor, guilt by association, and the pressured naming of names to prove one's own loyalty, mirroring the dynamics of Salem's confessions. Careers were destroyed, lives were ruined, and a climate of intense fear silenced dissent, all driven by the same engine of hysterical, mob-influenced justice that powered the trials. The parallels were so strong that playwright Arthur Miller explicitly drew the connection in his masterpiece, The Crucible, using the 17th century panic to critique the 20th century one. Salem endures because it is a timeless story about what happens when a society chooses the comfort of certainty over the hard work of justice, when it trades the rights of the individual for the illusion of collective security. The real haunting is not of ghosts but of patterns, and the warning from 1692 echoes whenever fear asks us to surrender our humanity for a promise of safety. The story of Salem refused to stay buried in the 17th century. It found new life on the stage and screen, reshaped by each generation to reflect its own deepest fears. No work did more to cement the trials in the modern imagination than Arthur Miller's 1953 play, The Crucible. Miller was not writing a strict history lesson, he was crafting a powerful and deliberate allegory for the Red Scare then gripping America. In the play, the paranoid accusations of witchcraft, the pressured confessions, and the destruction of innocent lives served as a direct parallel to Senator Joseph McCarthy's hunt for communist infiltrators. Miller saw the same deadly mechanics at work, a society so terrified of an invisible enemy that it abandoned reason, justice, and neighborly trust. By linking the two eras, The Crucible performed a kind of cultural alchemy, transforming the historical event into a universal parable about the cost of ideological purity and the ease with which fear can be weaponized. For millions, Miller's characters, John and Elizabeth Proctor, Giles Corey, and the manipulative Abigail Williams, became the faces of Salem, often overshadowing the real historical figures. The play's enduring power lies in its timeless question: what do you do when your community demands you betray your conscience to prove your loyalty? Later adaptations have stretched and molded the Salem story into countless forms, often prioritizing drama over facts. Television series like the supernatural drama Salem embraced pure Gothic horror, filling the town with actual witches, covens, and magical battles, turning history into a dark fantasy. The chilling adventures of Sabrina the Teenage Witch, in both its light-hearted and recent darker iterations, frequently use the trials as a foundational myth for witchcraft lore, a past trauma that defines the present. These versions tap into the primal, spooky atmosphere of the legend, the pointy hats and broomsticks that Halloween popularized. Meanwhile, novels and films often inject romantic subplots or simplify the complex social tensions into a straightforward battle between good and evil. While these creative liberties can make for compelling stories, they often smooth over the messy human realities, the property disputes, the theological debates, the slow creep of ordinary people into extraordinary cruelty. The real horror loses its potency when the witches are real because it lets the community off the hook. The fascination endures because Salem is a story kit, a framework waiting to be filled. Its core elements, accusation, secrecy, mass hysteria, and martyrdom, are tools that can be used to examine any era's anxieties, from political persecution to the dynamics of social media outrage. We keep returning to that frozen village because it holds up a dark mirror, asking us who we might become when the fear takes hold. For centuries, the exact ground where the gallows stood was a haunting mystery. The name Gallows Hill was etched into maps and local memory, pointing to a steep, wooded rise on the outskirts of Salem. Generations believed this was the place, and a city park was even established there in memorial. But the precise spot, the very soil that absorbed the final words and breaths of 20 innocent people, remained lost to time. The location of the victims' bodies was an even deeper secret. Tradition said they were buried in a mass grave near the gallows, denied Christian burial in hallowed ground. Yet no marker, no grave, no physical evidence of that terrible day had ever been found. The earth, it seemed, had swallowed the tragedy whole. That changed in 2016 when a team of researchers decided to treat the legend not as folklore but as a cold case. Historians and archaeologists, led by Professor Emerson Baker, launched the Gallows Hill Project. They began not with shovels but with technology and old paperwork. Using sophisticated ground-penetrating radar, they scanned the traditional hilltop park, searching for any sign of disturbed earth or human remains that might correspond to a mass burial. The radar found nothing, no evidence of large pits, no bone fragments, no hidden geology to suggest this was the place. The park, for all its solemn symbolism, was not the true site. Undeterred, the team turned to the documentary record, meticulously combing through centuries-old deeds, tax records, and eyewitness accounts. One critical clue came from a Boston merchant named Thomas Putnam, who wrote a letter in 1794 describing the executions. He noted they took place at a place called Gallows Hill, near the house of a Mr. Gallows. This was not a general area, but a specific property. By cross-referencing this with old maps and land grants, the researchers pinpointed a different location entirely. The true site was not the high, wooded summit everyone remembered, but a lower, rocky outcrop known as Proctor's Ledge. This ledge was a grimly practical choice for an execution. It was a barren, exposed shelf of bedrock, easily accessible by cart rowed from the jail, and most importantly, highly visible from the main road into Salem. Public executions were meant to be seen, to serve as a stark warning. A hidden hilltop would have defeated the purpose. Proctor's Ledge was in plain sight, a constant, chilling reminder to every traveler entering the town. The team's high-tech radar scans of this new location confirmed their hypothesis. The subsurface readings showed no evidence of burial pits there either, which was its own form of confirmation. This aligned with fragmentary historical accounts suggesting the victims were not buried at the gallows at all. After the executions, the bodies were likely cut down and hastily disposed of by the county sheriff. Given the rocky, crevice-ridden nature of the ledge, the simplest method would have been to push the remains into one of the many natural fissures in the granite outcrop. Family members, terrified and legally forbidden from claiming the bodies for proper burial, would have been powerless to intervene. Over centuries, soil, leaves, and urban development would have filled and obscured these cracks, sealing the victims in an unmarked, rocky tomb. This explains why, despite numerous searches over 300 years, no graves have ever been found. There are no coffins, no neatly arranged skeletons waiting for discovery. The victims became part of the ledge itself, their physical remains scattered and lost within the stone. The 2016 project did not end with a dramatic exhumation, but with a quiet, powerful certainty. The city of Salem officially recognized Proctor's Ledge as the execution site. A small memorial was later placed there, a simple slate wall inscribed with the victims' names overlooking the busy street below. This modern detective work did something profound. It replaced a vague, shadowy legend with a specific, sobering truth. It grounded the horror in a real place you can visit, a rocky shelf now sandwiched between a pharmacy and a residential street. The story of Salem, therefore, is never fully closed. It is an ongoing investigation where each generation brings new tools and new questions, slowly pulling history from the shadows of myth. 300 years after the last body swung from the rope, the town finally began to speak their names aloud. The physical memorials we see today are not ancient relics, they are modern apologies carved in stone and set in quiet gardens. The most prominent is the Salem Witch Trials Memorial, dedicated in 1992 on the 300th anniversary of the executions. Tucked behind the old cemetery on Charter Street in modern Salem, it is a place of profound stillness. You enter through a low stone wall, symbolizing the threshold between the present and that haunted past. Inside, 20 rough-hewn granite benches jut from the ground, each one bearing a name, the means of execution, and the date of death. The benches are arranged in a pattern, creating a somber aisle. Visitors often leave flowers, notes, or small stones on the slabs, a quiet act of remembrance that has transformed the space into a living testament. You can run your fingers over the carved letters, Bridget Bishop, June 10, 1692, or George Burroughs, August 19th. The design is intentionally stark and powerful. There are no statues of witches, no dramatic scenes of horror, just the brutal, undeniable facts of loss. It forces you to confront the humanity of each victim, not as characters in a legend, but as real people whose stories ended here. A short drive away, in what was once Salem Village and is now the town of Danvers, stands the Rebecca Nurse homestead. This is the only home of a person executed during the trials that is still open to the public. Walking the property, you see the simple, sturdy house where this pious grandmother lived, the land her family fought to keep, and the family cemetery where a monument to her was erected long after her body was denied burial. It grounds the tragedy in the domestic, in the life she built before the fear tore it all down. And then there is Proctor's Ledge, the rocky shelf confirmed as the actual killing ground. The memorial here is small and unassuming, a low stone wall set into the hillside overlooking a busy intersection. The names are etched into the granite, facing the street where daily life now passes by. This is perhaps the most poignant location of all, for it marks not where they lived, but precisely where they died, a stark reminder that history happened not in some distant, fog-shrouded field, but right here, in the midst of the ordinary world. These spaces are far more than stops on a tourist map. They are secular shrines to conscience, designed for quiet contemplation. They ask us not to marvel at the supernatural, but to reflect on the very human capacity for injustice, on the fragility of due process, and on the enduring need to remember those who were forgotten by their own community. To sit on a sun-warmed bench inscribed with a name is to perform a simple, powerful act to restore a dignity that was so violently stripped away. It is a promise to the past, etched in stone, that we will try, however imperfectly, to learn its hardest lessons. But the dynamics of Salem were not unique to a single New England village. The pattern of the witch hunt, a community purging its own members under the banner of a holy or ideological cause, is a tragic thread woven through human history. For nearly 3 centuries, from the 1500s to the 1700s, a wave of persecution swept across Europe and its colonies, fueled by the same volatile mix of religious fervor, social tension, and economic anxiety. In places like Trier, Germany, entire villages were left nearly empty after hundreds of executions. In Sweden, a moral panic over children's accusations led to mass trials and burnings. The infamous witch finders of England, like Matthew Hopkins, traveled from town to town, using cruel and deceptive tests to identify witches for a fee, turning fear into a profitable industry. While the scale and methods varied, the core mechanism was eerily consistent. A real crisis, whether it was the aftermath of war, a devastating famine, or an outbreak of plague, would create unbearable stress. That stress would then seek a tangible, evil cause, and it would inevitably find that cause in society's most vulnerable members, the elderly, the poor, the healers with unconventional knowledge, or anyone who simply did not fit in. These historical episodes were not isolated bouts of madness. They were systemic failures where the institutions meant to protect people instead became the engines of their destruction. The term witch hunt has survived long after the belief in witchcraft faded because the social sickness it describes never truly vanished. It simply found new witches to chase. In our modern world, the accusations are not about spectral pinches or pacts with the devil, but they follow the same dangerous logic. We see it in political campaigns where opponents are not just disagreed with, but branded as traitors or enemies of the state, their reputations shredded by viral allegations that require no evidence to stick. We see it on social media platforms where a single out-of-context post can trigger a digital mob, a frenzy of public shaming and career destruction that operates with the speed of a virus and the finality of a gallows. Due process, the careful weighing of facts, is abandoned for the swift, satisfying rush of collective judgment. The modern witch might be a public figure, a co-worker, or just an ordinary person who expressed an unpopular opinion. The afflicted girls of the digital age are not children in a minister's parlor, but an anonymous crowd behind screens, their performances of outrage amplified by algorithms designed to maximize engagement. The result, while not physical death, can be a profound social and professional death, a silencing that serves the same purpose, to purge the community of a perceived contaminant. This begs a vital, uncomfortable question for all of us. What are the underlying fears that could, under the right conditions, spark a new cycle of blame and persecution today? Is it the pervasive anxiety about rapid technological change and artificial intelligence, a force we don't fully understand that seems to threaten our jobs and our sense of reality? Is it the terror of a new, invisible pandemic where fear of the sick or the foreign could again twist into suspicion and hatred? Or is it the age-old fear of the outsider, repackaged in debates over immigration and cultural identity? These are the modern forests at the edge of our village, filled with shadows we do not fully comprehend. The lesson of Salem is not that people in the past were stupid or cruel. It is that they were human, just like us. When fear becomes the loudest voice in the room, reason and empathy are often the first casualties. The safeguards we must strengthen are not just legal but personal, a commitment to pause before we share, to question before we condemn, and to remember that behind every accusation there is a human being. The real test of a society is not whether it can identify its witches, but whether it can resist the primal urge to look for them in the first place. Even after all the evidence is weighed, the story of Salem refuses to be fully solved. It leaves behind a haunting collection of unanswered questions, small mysteries that rattle in the quiet spaces of the historical record. Why, for instance, did the afflictions first seize those particular girls in Reverend Parris's household and not others? Was there something uniquely stressful about their lives, some unspoken tension within that home that made them the flashpoint? We can map the social rivalries and identify the ergot fungus, but the exact catalyst, the moment the match was struck, remains just out of sight. This leads to the central, enduring puzzle: what was the precise recipe? Historians and scientists can list the ingredients: the psychological repression, the potential biological trigger, the simmering land disputes, the climate of frontier terror. Yet we still cannot say with certainty the exact proportions that blended together to create that perfect storm. It is the ultimate historical caution, a reminder that human behavior, especially in groups, is a complex chemistry where cause and effect are rarely a straight line. Some figures from the trials add to this lingering sense of the inexplicable. Consider the unyielding Chief Justice William Stoughton. While others, like Judge Sewall, performed public penance, Stoughton never expressed a shred of doubt. He presided over the final cleanup court after the panic subsided, still convinced of the guilt of those who had been pardoned. What kind of inner certainty, or perhaps profound denial, allowed a man to sleep at night after sending 19 people to the gallows on evidence he later had to dismiss? His unwavering stance is a different kind of mystery, one of a conscience that remained perfectly intact amidst a sea of error. Then there is the long shadow cast on the accusers themselves. What became of the girls whose visions condemned a community? Their later lives were often marked by quiet tragedy and profound regret. Ann Putnam Jr., who had been one of the most prolific accusers, stood before the Salem village congregation in 1706, a young woman of 26. She publicly confessed that she had been deluded by Satan, and that out of ignorance and weakness she had been an instrument for accusing several persons of a grievous crime. She asked for forgiveness, specifically naming Rebecca Nurse and others, and expressed hope that her terrible error would not be held against her parents' memory. She never married and died a decade later. Her life and the lives of others like her became a long, private reckoning with a public horror they helped create. They lived with the knowledge that their childhood fits, whether born of illness, hysteria, or something else, had unleashed a force they could never take back. This, perhaps, is the final and most important lesson Salem leaves us. The real story was never about witches. It was about the terrifying fragility of the human community. It revealed how quickly the bonds of trust and neighborliness can dissolve under pressure, replaced by a desperate, self-consuming hunt for security. The trials show us that the greatest dangers are not supernatural, but the very human temptations of fear, blame, and the hunger for certainty when the world feels out of control. The mystery that endures is not what happened in Salem, but whether we have truly learned to recognize those same impulses within ourselves. The final, chilling truth of Salem is that no single villain caused the tragedy. It was a chain reaction where each link, from a pastor's desperate diagnosis to a judge's unyielding certainty, was forged in fear. What began as a mysterious illness in a quiet parlor spiraled into a catastrophic failure of justice because every institution designed to stop it, from medicine to religion to the courts, became an instrument of the panic instead. This was not the work of a few evil people, but the collapse of an entire community's moral and legal immune system. The real story is a perfect storm, a confluence of forces that feels terrifyingly familiar even 3 centuries later. Religious extremism provided the language of absolute good and evil. Bitter social strife over land and power gave the accusations a deadly direction. Political instability and frontier violence created a backdrop of chronic collective anxiety. and human psychology, with its need to find a simple cause for complex suffering, provided the spark that lit the tinder. When you combine those elements, the question shifts from how could they do that to what would stop us from doing the same. The enduring legacy of Salem is not a ghost story, but a warning etched in the names of 20 innocent people. It is a stark lesson in the vital importance of due process, that slow, careful machinery of justice that stands as the only reliable bulwark against the swift, satisfying cruelty of the mob. It reminds us that fear-mongering, the act of turning vague anxiety into a specific, hateable enemy, is one of the oldest and most destructive forces in human history. And perhaps most importantly, it underscores the perpetual need to protect the marginalized, the different, and the vulnerable, for they are always the first targets when a society looks for someone to blame. History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The echoes of Salem can be heard in any era where fear is allowed to drown out reason, and where the desire for safety is used to justify the abandonment of our common humanity. What lesson from this dark chapter resonates most with you today? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this journey into the heart of a historical mystery compelling, subscribe for more deep dives into the past where we untangle the complex truths behind the legends.